So, in the last chapter, we looked at a whole bunch of questions that might come up when we start discussing this topic of voluntary poverty, and it can seem very difficult to find the right answers. So, in this chapter, Father Dubay discusses the basic criteria for finding the right answer. But before he gets into that, he has a very interesting discussion of why it is that people disagree. For one thing, he says that it can be very difficult to think rationally when we're confronted with the claim that our lifestyle might need to change. As I remember that someone put it, that if multiplication table made as many moral claims on us as the Ten Commandments do, we'd find just as much disagreement about the multiplication tables as we find about the Ten Commandments. So there's already this emotional investment in a way of life that can make it difficult to come to agreement. But still, with all those difficulties, basic relativism about these questions is not helpful. We do need to try and find the truth instead of just remaining satisfied with disagreement. So then we have to look at the sources of disagreement beyond the surface emotional resistance that people might feel. Why do people disagree? And he says, for one thing, people could just be defining the terms differently. For instance, if someone defines voluntary poverty as being homeless on the street, then they're going to obviously disagree that it's something suitable for most Catholic laity to embrace. The facts that we're using to back things up might not be facts at all. If someone argues that Christ never said anything about voluntary poverty, then that's not a fact. It's not consistent with the gospel. Or there could be a difference of fundamental presuppositions. And this is where he says a lot of disagreements reside. That we have these deeply held beliefs that we don't even consider to be beliefs. They're just part of the background, something we simply assume that everyone shares. And those presuppositions color everything else we decide to do or decide to think about. So, for instance, if we're set on following God, we're going to have a very different set of basic presuppositions from someone who doesn't think that God exists. And that's going to color many of our other decisions and many of our other ideas. So then, to find the truth in this particular matter about voluntary poverty, we need to carefully define terms. We need to carefully study our sources to find the facts of the matter. And we need to be open to following God's will. And with that said, he goes to laying out a set of primary criteria, the most important criteria for our discussion. And those criteria are, of course, the divine revelation in the New Testament. Anything we decide has to be consistent with what Christ says in the New Testament. And then the teaching of the church, since we have a church that can explain the inner meaning of the gospel and help us to deepen our understanding of the message. Whatever we decide has to be consistent with the whole of Revelation. So, for instance, surely it should make a difference to our thinking that Jesus himself was poor, or that Christian ethics calls for self-denial, or that we worship a God who is himself a community of love in the Trinity. All the different parts of the Christian revelation are not just scattered, isolated facts and ideas. Instead, they're all part of a consistent whole. And every conclusion that we come to needs to be consistent with that whole. And then he says another is the fruits that come from a certain way of life. We know that the Catholic Church in the United States doesn't tend to emphasize factual voluntary poverty. But how is our church doing? Is it in great shape, or are the fruits lacking? And then the saints, both what they said and their way of life, that we're part of a community, part of a tradition, and we can look to those who have gone before us to inform our own actions and our own thoughts. As well as these primary criteria, there is some secondary criteria that aren't quite as authoritative, but that need to be taken into account so that we have a full picture of what the facts really are. And one of those is sociological and political analysis, that we can't leave out of account the millions of starving people in the third world and the various economic realities that underlie our affluent lifestyle. And another is philosophical reflection. For instance, we can reflect on what it means to love another person and what having such love should mean for our use of material possessions. And finally, we have lived experience, which, with the caveat that not all lived experiences are equally valid in light of the gospel. In the next chapter, he will go on to list a set of basic premises derived from the Christian revelation that should guide all of our future discernment on this topic.